Good morning, everyone. My name is Katie Domrat, and I am the coordinator of adult programs here at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome my colleague Jeffrey Allison, the director of statewide programs and exhibitions. He is going to speak today about a few objects in our Native American collection. So, with that, I will pass it off to you, Jeffrey.
Thanks so much, Katie, and it's great to be here, and it's great to welcome all of you out there in digital land. And we are going to talk about quills, beads, and clay from the VMFA Native American collection. I thought it might be a good opportunity to look at some of the specific materials that have been used traditionally, and also how some of the same materials are continuing to be used by 20th and 21st century Native artists that are also represented in our collections. So today I'm going to have Katie click the slides for me. So Katie, would you like to click the first slide?
Absolutely.
Excellent. So we'll start with wampum belts and really start with this word wampum, which I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the word means. Possibly because we all watched Looney Tune cartoons growing up and Warner Brothers Westerns and things where the terminology has certainly gotten twisted over the years. A wampum belt, like the one that you see here from 2021, made by Martin Siniga, who's from a Safani tribe, is a specific type of wampum, but it's actually the shells that are wampum, and they can be used in many other ways besides just wampum belts. The one you see, if you read it, 1936, VMFA 2021, as hopefully all of you know, we opened the VMFA in 1936 to the public, and in 2021, this belt was made. So it celebrates that whole time period of the VMFA. And on the right, you see a close-up of these shells. And you can see that they're actually multiple colors. And if we click on to the next slide, I think. There we go. And there are the actual shells. And I actually have some things here with me. If you were here with me in person, we would be passing these things around as we did Tuesday during the live session. But this is exactly the same shell that you see there. And as you see, they're both white and purple. And people have a lot of interest in exactly how you transform a shell like this into a perfectly symmetrical bead-like object that also has a hole bored through it. And the shells are actually broken up and sanded down using rocks. And then there is a strong rod, whether it's made out of wood or another piece of shell or rock. And if you can imagine looping a piece of rawhide around that and running it back and forth like that, so that each one of those hundreds and hundreds of beads that you see on a typical wampum belt, that's the very complex and involved process to create that bead. It should be said that particularly in the 19th century, when other methods were introduced, they were used immediately. The idea of having a drill that would replicate that hole in exactly the same place, and other industrial technology certainly has made that easier. Wampum belts are still made today. Let's go to the next slide. Here's shapes and patterns, and we think about wampum belts. They have many purposes. Some of them are incredibly sacred and may be viewed once and then put away, and literally no one can ever touch it again. Others represent treaties. I have a wampum belt here that was made for me to use at the VMFA, and this is actually a nominating belt. And in matrilineal societies, the women actually would be choosing the men who are members of the council, and elder woman or mother would walk behind the nominee and walk into the circle and then place the belt over the shoulder of the person that's nominated to be the new member of that council. And so this one, because it's made for me for this purpose, it's perfectly fine for me to use it and to share with other people. Other things that it can be used for are mnemonic devices. We think about all the cultures that have oral traditions and that pass down history, that pass down mythology. And the key there is to make sure that those stories that are told, that history that's told, is exactly the same from generation to generation to generation. So people are chosen who are going to be the keeper of that knowledge. Most often, again, it would be a woman in many societies. And those belts can be used to maintain the veracity of that story or that history. So they serve many purposes, but wampum, the shells can be turned into necklaces. They can be turned into decorative beads that would be applied to other things as well. Let's look at the next slide, which I think is pretty cool. Again, we see that belt that's from our collection, and on the left, you see the creation of a new belt like the one that I have in the 21st century, and you can see that these beads are woven onto either gut or some sort of rope or fabric, etc. In the center, you see Chief Joseph Johnson seated center with a lot of these belts in front of him. And he is with anthropologist Horatio Hale, which is a very 19th century name, I think, on the left, and fellow chiefs of the Mohawk Nation. And the interesting thing about Horatio Hale is that he spent many, many years documenting different wampum belts and creating the equivalent of a dictionary or an encyclopedia so that we can read his research and identify certain things and uses of certain belts that have come down to us. On the right is a modern wampum belt from the 21st century. And, if you so desire, you can go out and actually buy a wampum belt like this. It's, to me, a reproduction, although it's authentic in terms of the way that it's made. Next, Katie. Thanks. Moccasins are an extraordinarily important part of looking at Native American culture from the past through the present. Here are two beautiful examples in our collection, the Sioux moccasins from the 19th century on the left and Cheyenne moccasins on the right. And you can see how incredibly different the beadwork is. And those patterns are repeated within each culture. The colors are different. The beads are dyed with natural dyes, either from plants or rocks, as it were. And those patterns can represent many things. I have, again, children's moccasins here. Let's see, there you go. That specific pattern is a protective symbol. So it seems very appropriate that on a children's moccasin like this, that you would want to put a symbol on there that's all about protection and protecting the infant. The other thing to look at with moccasins is the bottom. If you look at this has a leather bottom. That means it comes from the Southwest. If you look at Eastern Woodlands Indians, they're soft leather because they don't require the same level of protection on the foot, as it were. Next slide. There are a lot of patterning and decorations, as I've said. Originally, and what I find really great fun here in the office, all of those patterns and decorations would have been done with porcupine quills. And you see I have those here. And I have them sealed up in this plastic box for a very real reason. Porcupine quills have barbs on them, just like fish hooks. And many years ago, a dear colleague of mine came into my office the day that I got the bag of these. It was a plastic bag filled with porcupine quills. And without thinking, she said, "What's that?" and reached her hand into the bag. And when she pulled it out, if you can imagine, all those porcupine quills were stuck into her skin on her hand. And most of them were easy to remove, but the ones that got in deep enough, the only way, just like with a fish hook, you have to either push it all the way through or you have to cut the barb off and remove it. So please be careful around porcupines and porcupine quills. The fun thing about porcupines is it's a renewable resource because basically when you frighten the porcupine, those quills are released and frighten animals away. I've often wondered what it would be like to be the person gathering the porcupine quills because it seems like a pretty dangerous profession. Let's go back for just a second. That's okay. One other thing, you see beads there, and those are glass beads. And with the introduction of glass trade beads, as you can imagine, people very quickly moved from using things like porcupine quills to something that's much easier to use. And there are several different types of glass beads, including seed beads. So the tiny beads that we're going to look at are seed beads. The larger beads like this would be also used for decorative purposes on many different objects. It's interesting to note that the reason I have this is exactly the same beads produced in the same factory in what was Yugoslavia that were used as trade beads as soon as Europeans came to this continent. And they were closed down during the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, those factories were reopened, and the same industrialization was used to create the same exact beads. There's no difference, literally, other than age, between the bead I'm holding and a bead that would have been used in the 19th century. Okay, let's go on to something else. Thanks. Again, different cultures have very different looks. These moccasins from the 19th century from Zuni culture in our collection are incredibly different looking from the high top Apache culture moccasins. And again, the Arapaho children's moccasins that we have in our collection. And again, those are children's moccasins. So you can see, again, from culture to culture, how different that application of the beads and other decorative items may be. You can also see, particularly on the Apache culture, that they're much higher boots, and again, that use of very different decorative applications. Next. This is a beaded bagpipe, and we have it in our collection, and it's probably well over a foot long, maybe a foot and a half. And as the name says, it would have been used to store a pipe, more often a sacred pipe. The bowl of that pipe, particularly if we're looking at Sioux cultures, would have come from one specific quarry. It's really the only place in the United States, certainly, where you can get the specific type of stone. It's a soft, sort of sand-colored stone that's easily manipulated into the shape of a bowl. And it's the bowl that becomes the sacred object, not the stem, because the stems are replaceable. And as a sidebar, we have a lot of works by George Catlin in our Mellon collection, which you should come to see if you've never seen them. And George Catlin documented Native American culture through painting and collection of objects, most famously from 1930 to 36 when he traveled throughout the plains. And I'll say this, finagled his way into being able to go to what was really a sacred site where the stone was mined. And because he was a scientist, painter, explorer, if you go and look up the stone today, it's called Catlinite. So one who gets to document it and put it into the scientific publications gets to name things after them. The other thing to say about this bag is I may have said once the pipe is in it, it would have been, particularly if you're in a culture, say, that had a teepee, it would have been placed at the very back side of the teepee to be cared for. They also eventually had many other uses. You can think about something that's not a pipe bag that would be more squat, that becomes a medicine bag, and other things like that. A medicine bag would contain objects that, just like a wampum belt, which is sort of predominantly East Coast tribal object. If you go to the far west, the medicine bag would hold objects that, again, had a mnemonic value, so that you could pull things out and tell the exact same story over and over again without embellishing, as we all like to do, like I love to do when I'm talking like this. So next slide. Thanks. And here's quill work. And again, there are those porcupine quills. And one of the things about that pipe bag is it contains both quill work and bead work. So just because those beads came into use didn't mean that quills ceased to be used at all. Once the quill is off the porcupine, they're soaked in water for quite a long time, and they're actually chewed so that they become incredibly malleable, and they can be easily woven into the strips of leather on the object. Here's a bag with quill work from the 19th century that's at the Institute of American Indian Studies in Washington State. Over here is a war shirt detail, absolutely stunning. Again, they're dyed with the same natural dyes that would be used. And if you look at this, this is 1850. And throughout most of the life of that war shirt, it would not have been kept in anything like a museum. And look at how vibrant and how much these quills have retained their color over more than a century. So I think that's, it goes to just the incredible quality of craftsmanship and the quality of the materials that are used. Next. Thanks. And there's a Lakota pipe bag, 1880, and then Lakota Sioux pipe bag, 1880 to 1900. And again, in having both of those materials in them, and a Cheyenne River Sioux troop in traditional dress or regalia, singing and dancing at the Native Nations procession in 2004 in Washington, D.C., and covered with the regalia would be covered with quills. And it's always good to remember that when you're talking about Native dress, Native American clothing, that these items they're wearing, that is regalia. Next. There we go. And lastly, I'm going to talk about my friend Virgil Ortiz, who I think is one of the greatest contemporary American artists who is Native American that is creating work right now. And I said that in a very specific way. If you come to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts today and you see the works that I'm going to share with you that we have by Virgil Ortiz, they're in the American Gallery first. They're also 21st century works. There are also works created by an artist who is Native American, and his culture is extraordinarily important to what he does and who he is, but it is not something to be pigeonholed necessarily and placed sort of in a separate space where Native American objects only can exist. And he works with traditional materials, ceramics, and you can see him here carving a piece. You can see him in this beautiful photograph on the right. We had the opportunity to have Virgil here for several days when we opened a show, oh gosh, 8 years ago now, maybe, in our own words. And he came and he said ahead of time, he said, Jeffrey, I want you to go and find the 2 tallest models, male models that you can find in the city of Richmond. And we were able to find these strapping, they were 6'4", if not 6'5" tall. And then he spent an entire day during family day creating their costumes. The first thing he did was add shoes that were another 6 to 8 inches tall so that they totally loomed over you, and created these aeronauts that we're going to talk about. And it was so much fun leading them around throughout that family day and interacting with people. He creates a lot of pottery pieces. He creates sculptural pieces that are figurative. And let's move on to this next slide. These are the 2 works that we have on display currently, and they're aeronauts, and one is Cuda and one is Stu. And they are incredibly interesting because of why they were created. And Virgil had young children, and as they started to grow up, he realized that they really did not know anything about their culture's history. These are Pueblo natives from New Mexico, and they didn't have pride in a very important history that they had. And the Cachita Pueblo were so proud of the fact that they were able to drive the Spanish out after the Spanish had incurred upon them. Sad to say, the Spanish eventually came back. But for a while, they were able to expel the Spanish and return to their normal life. And how am I going to teach this to my children, and how am I going to make it interesting? Well, Virgil is also a huge Star Wars fan. And so he basically wrote a science fiction novel. And he now has it as a screenplay, and it's being shopped around. So hopefully one day we'll be able to say that we know Virgil Ortiz, the writer of this amazing Steven Spielberg directed movie or something. But he created the concept of aeronauts. And when the Spanish invaded and his tribe started to fight to get them out of there, they got help from extraterrestrials. The extraterrestrials appeared, and there were aeronauts. One was Cuda, one was Stu, and there were others. And after they were able to make the Spanish leave, Stu and Cuda and the others returned to their spaceships and went back into outer space. Well, their spaceships were the top of mountains, triangular mountains. And when the spaceship left, that's what created all those amazing plateaus that you see when you drive through a place like New Mexico. And as you can imagine, all of a sudden, all of the young people were very interested in their history. And it has helped to reestablish that interest in history, in language, to continue those traditions that have been around for centuries into the 21st century. So these objects are remarkable. Now that you know that they're extraterrestrial, maybe it changes the way that you look at them. A lot of people see influences from a lot of other cultures in them. The other thing I should say about Virgil's technique is he works with a very traditional technique. And one of the things that just amazes me, as things artists do often do, is that he's applying that black line onto this piece while the other thing is wet. And so he can't touch it with his hand. And he has to be very sure of creating each of those lines without touching the piece, which I could never do. And then with these works, he's actually using a traditional method where you bury the works in the ground, and the ground becomes the kiln. And so it's always said you never know what you're going to get until you open that pit up. They could have shattered, or they could have run, or they could be in perfect shape like these pieces. But certainly potters, people who work in ceramics, and people who work in glass have that attitude that if it shatters, it shatters. If it's glass, it goes back into the bin because it can be reused. And I feel like there's something a little bit freeing. You'll notice that the slip and wild spinach paint. So again, all of this is traditional materials utilized in a very 21st century creation. Next. If there's another, there it is. One of the other things I love about Virgil is that he was asked to create an entire collection for Donna Karan. So in addition to being, an incredibly well-known and inventive artist, a visual artist, he has also created his own fashion lines for Donna Karan. He is, again, creating hopefully what will become a motion picture one day, but has already been turned into a graphic novel, which I think is very exciting as well. He has more energy than anyone I know. He kept me awake all night the entire time he was here and never slowed down, and loved Richmond and the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, I should say. So is that it? That may be it. Anything else? And there's some more of the fashion. And there's Virgil with some of his creations, as you can see, and some of his designs. That's a scarf. The jewelry, I think they're phenomenal. I can't afford them personally, but I would love to. And so keep your eye out for that. And, after this presentation, go online and look him up on the website, Virgil Ortiz. He has an extraordinary story. He was featured several months ago in the magazine that's created by the National Museum of the American Indian with the cover story. So keep an eye out for Virgil. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeffrey.